Little Match Girl. Actually, I was the model for him in the Little Match Girl.
That's the voice of Charnelle Pinkney Barlow. She's an author, illustrator, and the granddaughter of the legendary Jerry Pinkney. But hold that thought for a moment. I have to kind of go back and give you a backstory before I give you the interview. Growing up, I had a lot of books in my house, many with illustrations that I really liked. One name on those books that I recognized was Jerry Pinkney. But for years, I never knew that that author was a black man. And I never knew that he was the first individual black illustrator to win the Caldecott Medal, the highest honor in children's book illustration. I also learned that the little girl in the pages of one of the most beloved books of his was actually his granddaughter. Today, that granddaughter is an author and illustrator in her own right. And she wrote a children's book about what it felt like to be inside his studio and inside that world. Her name is Charnelle Pinkney Barlow, and this is her story. Jerry Pinkney illustrated more than 100 children's books over a career that spanned nearly 6 decades. He was the first solo black illustrator to win the Caldecott Medal, the most prestigious award in children's book illustration in America. He won it in 2010 for The Lion and the Mouse, a retelling of an Aesop fable that he set in the Serengeti, surrounded by African wildlife. He also designed postage stamps for the U.S. Postal Service, won 5 Coretta Scott King Awards, and was the most exhibited illustrator in American museums. He passed in 2021, but his legacy still very much alive. I spoke with Charnelle Pinkney Barlow, his granddaughter, about her new children's book, which takes readers inside one place most of his fans never saw, his art studio.
I got into writing and illustration mainly because I was around it a lot when I was growing up. My parents both did books together. My grandparents did books together. My aunt and uncle did books together. So it was just something that was always around. And I liked coloring and I liked drawing. And eventually I was like, yeah, I think this is something that I want to do and like go to school for.
And then Charnelle told me something that I think that will make you look at his books very differently.
So my grandfather, Jerry Pinkney, was a world-renowned children's book illustrator. And growing up, I was always at my grandparents' house, always hanging out in his art studio. And so that was just something that I was, that I grew up with. I would go into his studio, he would show me the stuff he was working on. He'd always have books set aside for me. And it was just a joy to be in that space. Like going into his art studio was like literally just a different world. You go in and there's music playing and art everywhere. And so what a lot of people see, like a lot of people know his books and they read the articles and they see the interviews, but they didn't get to spend time like in his space with him, like as he's working, and just daily life. And so after he passed away, that was something that I wanted to share and like show, like, yeah, you guys see the books, but I want to show you guys something that you haven't seen before because you don't get that little tidbit of like seeing the everyday stuff. And I wanted to share that part of my story.
For those who don't know who your granddad was, tell us a little bit about what are some of the stories that you remember stood out about him and what people most remember him for, but perhaps are a little different for you.
So a lot of people know him for his stories like Lion and the Mouse. That was a very big one. The ones that I remember the most are the ones that he did in the 90s. So like the Talking Eggs, that's one of my favorites. Like I love that one. Mirandy and Brother Wind, that's another one of my favorites. What else? Um, well, it was just in my head. Little Match Girl. Actually, I was the model for him in the Little Match Girl, which a lot
Oh,
of people don't know. I put a like a little picture in the back of the book um,
yeah.
of one of his sketches and then one of his reference photos that he took of me. And so Yeah, so like my favorite stories are the ones that I grew up with because like I was there and I got to see his dummy sketches and his process and yeah.
What what do you think that people who have read his books, they think about him, and what do you see differently about him because you were his grandchild, so you had a different kind of perspective. What do you think is some of the main things that you saw that was different about him as a person?
Well, I think a lot of people like they see the artist, right? They see the dedication, they see the discipline, but they didn't get to see the how he was with his family. And like he always made time for us. He always had time for us. Whenever I'd go and visit, and he was usually working, but he'd be like, "Oh, come down to my studio, after lunch." And he would always just drop what he was doing and spend time with us. And so a lot of people don't see like the family side. Like he was really funny. And he would like take me to museums and stuff when I would visit. He'd be like, "Oh, there's this show at a local museum. Like, let's go." And then he would bring back like like the pamphlets from different like museum shows and stuff. He would always bring me those back and like mail them to me when I was at school. So it's just he was always thinking about everyone else. I'm like, "Oh, I think you would like this," and "Oh, you would really love that," or "Oh, I saw that you were drawing a lot of patterns. Here's a book on, these patterns from India that like really reminded me of the stuff you were working on." So he was always just very cognizant of like his family and what they would enjoy and what reminded him of them.
Oh, sounds like a wonderful grandpa. This book really feels intimate and
Mhm.
sensory. It has sounds, quiet,
Yeah.
the quiet of the studio, the closeness between you and your grandpa. How
hmm
did you decide which moments belonged on the page and which ones you didn't put in there?
Well, that was tough because there's obviously, years and years of experiences. And so when I started writing it, a little more, it was a little more literal, I guess. But I did want to focus on sound because sound was a very like big thing that I remember because he would always be playing music and it was always like upbeat in the morning and then like more slow and like soft like jazz in the evening. So like you always knew, what time of day it was, what he's working on based on the music that was playing. And so like that's one thing that really stuck out to me was sound. So I was like, okay, well, I definitely want to focus on that. But then it was about how do I take all of these experiences and kind of truncate it down to like a day. And so I kind of picked like, okay, well, what were like my favorite moments? So like when he would pick out books for me, like that was one of my favorite moments, or when I would read like his latest book, because he would always show us like, the latest books that he did. Um, Sitting down and there was this one like leather chair, it's like an oversized leather chair. And I was a small child. I'm still petite, but but I would like sit in the leather chair and you kind of sink down and like your feet are hovering over the floor. And so I would focus on like small moments like that and like what are those like feelings that I wanted to show people that you don't get to see like just looking at a children's book or just looking at pictures in an article. So that's how I went and chose like okay, like let's put this in. I did a lot of a lot of editing, but
Yeah, I can't imagine. It must have taken a long time was the process like a year, more than that? What did it take to get to your final, like you were saying, this is it?
yeah, I think writing it was about 9 months to a year. Um, I'm in a writing critique group as part of like my agency, and so like we get together each month and they help me kind of like, okay, nope, that's not working, that's not working. This is really working. Keep going with this. So I love them. They're amazing. And so yeah, writing it took about like 9 months to a year, and then the illustrations took about the same time.
Yeah, like a baby, basically, the gestation of a child.
hmm
We don't often see Black grandfathers or Black father figures more
hmm
broadly centered, especially in books like this, children's books, where they're gentle, they're nurturing, they're creative, in creatively present in children's books. Why do you think that that's really important for, I know this is important for your story because you're sharing the memory of your grandfather, but I'm sure it was kind of a bigger, bigger than that. Do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like,
What she answers next reveals a lot about her process as an author. But here's something really important. Charnelle Pinkney Barlow didn't start out as a writer. She almost missed that entirely. And it's what her grandmother did that changed everything. You can hear the full conversation on The Color Between the Lines, available on iHeartRadio, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Esther Dillard. Before we get to the rest of the conversation, if you're an educator, a parent, or anybody who uses storytelling to connect with young people, I want you to know about resources that I have waiting just for you. It's at my Etsy shop, Color Between the Lines Market. I have educator guides, discussion tools, and lesson bundles built around conversations just like this one. And if you subscribe to my Substack, the link is in the show notes. I'll send you a free discussion guide every time I drop a new episode. Now let's get back to the conversation.
with the history of Black literature in America, there's a lot of Black stories that still need to be told. And so, we're putting out more and more stories, but there's a lot of stories that still need to be put out. And I think stories about grandfathers and fathers are part of that category. Because we don't really see those stories a lot in bookstores. And we're seeing more now, but I think it's good to keep adding to it. And my grandfather and even my father have played, a really important role in my life, especially when it comes to art and how I see the world and how I take that and then put it, on the page. And so I wanted to share like that bond that I had with him, with everyone.
I know that you mentioned that music was a big part of how his creative process. Is that also for you? Because I know for myself, a lot of
Mhm.
times music will help me craft like maybe the middle of the story or the
Mhm.
beginning of the story. It just gets me off the ground. Is that
Mhm.
how you use music as well?
Yeah, so with me, I usually am obsessed with like one specific album, like while I'm working on a project. And then whenever I hear that album afterwards, I'm like, oh, yeah, I was working on this. So even in high school, and I would just like have like just one album just playing for the entire project. And it would really just depend on what I was feeling. So sometimes it'd be gospel. With this project, it was the Hamilton, mu the musical. Yeah, it was that soundtrack. I had that on like just on repeat. But it has to be something that I'm familiar with and something that I don't really have to, think a lot about. It's kind of just something that keeps me invested, keeps my mind focused. So yeah, it changes a lot. But yeah.
So, what do you hope that parents and caregivers take away from this book when they read it aloud with their children? And then I'm sure that the message is a little different for the children that read the book by themselves.
Yeah, so there's a few things. So one of the things that I talked about within the story was like being recognized as an artist. And there's a part in the story where, my grandfather says, every artist sees the world differently. And I'm like, artist? I've never thought of myself as an artist before. And so I think there's always this point where children are kind of steered away from the arts and they start getting more self-conscious about what they're doing right or what they're doing wrong when it comes to drawing. And I want them to know like there's nothing perfect. Everyone sees the world differently. Every child sees the world differently. Every parent, every guardian. And so there's no right way to do art. However you want to express yourself is the right way for you. So that's definitely one of the things. There's something else, and it has skipped my mind.
Well, it sounds like the imperfection is the perfection of it all in a way.
Yes. Definitely.
I wanted to make sure that got that other point in if you can remember it. But if your grandfather was here alive today and he could hear children reading this story, what do you think that he would he would think and maybe want his other people to understand about him and just about family, creativity, that kind of thing.
I would think well, A, he'd be very proud. And then I think he would really be proud of the fact that um the message of art is about like seeing the world. Because that was something that he would always, talk to me about is like art is about seeing. So like seeing what's in front of you and not just, drawing what you think something looks like. Because it's very easy to be like, oh, a bottle, I know what that looks like. And you draw it and then you look at the actual bottle, you're like, ah, actually, that's not what it looks like. Like art is about like really seeing and then interpreting that and telling your own story. And we all have a story to tell. And I think that was a big thing, especially with his own art and telling his own story. And drawing the stuff that he saw every day. He would always go on walks in the woods, and usually with like my brothers and stuff. I wasn't really a big nature person, but he would fill his sketchbooks with a lot of animals and stuff that he would see. They lived in upstate New York. Well, they say upstate, but Croydon on
That's
Hudson. Yeah.
oh, okay.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of wildlife. There's foxes, squirrels, chipmunks, sometimes bears, but hopefully you don't run into those. But he would always, just observe what was around him and put it on paper, and a lot of times it ended up in his stories.
It's funny, but when I hear you talk, I wonder, did at any point when you were putting this together, did you feel like his presence was kind of helping you put this together?
Yeah, I would always like kind of think about, what he would say and think about just the times that we spent together and stuff and try to remember the stuff he would tell me as he's looking through my art and try to put like that feeling, into the manuscript.
What's next?
What's next? Yes. Well, what's next? I have one other book publishing this year. It's called Cowgirl Dreaming. It's actually right behind me. It's by R.J. Owens. And so that will be coming out in May of this year. And then other than that, I'm working on some more manuscripts and trying to do some more writing, get some more books published. And yeah, because I have a lot more stories to get out there.
Have you found when you're writing the story and you're illustrating the story, are they
Mhm.
two separate things or are they a combined thing as is that process of writing the story going at the same time that you're creating the images, or is it vice versa?
For me, I have to write it first. Like for me, it's words first, like not even thinking about what it's gonna look like, and then after that, then I start focusing on the illustration. And when I did my first book, Little Rosetta and the Talking Guitar, I thought like, oh, of course, like I'm an illustrator at heart. Obviously, I'll probably, figure out what it looks like first and then go from there. But I could not. I had to do all of the writing first. And then once the writing was done, then I was like, okay, now I can focus on the illustration because I know, what the words say. Nothing's moving, nothing's changing. And then I can focus on what I want it to look like.
Was there a moment in your life where you said, I thought this is really it inspired you to actually go for writing because I'm sure that you were trying to figure out what you wanted to do as you were growing up and maybe I'd like to do this or maybe I'd like to do that. But then what was that thing that happened that said, "Oh, I want to do what my grandfather does."
Well, my grandma would always encourage me to write. Like when I was growing up and stuff, she got me like they got me this one sketchbook that on one side it had like blank paper to sketch, but then when you flipped it over, the other side had lined paper to write. And so she would always tell me to like write stories and stuff like that. But I didn't think I was going to be like a writer per se. I knew like I wanted to do illustration and then while doing illustration and like going through school and stuff, then I was like, okay, maybe I do want to write. And so my grandma definitely played a large part in that, and then my mother as well, because my mother wrote a handful of books. And so, that's kind of just like the other side of the coin. Like it was always there. And then I finally decided, like, okay, you know what? I do want to write as well.
Charnelle Pinkney Barlow's book, Two Artists, Grandad and Me, is now available wherever books are sold. I'm Esther Dillard. This is The Color Between the Lines, where your story matters.